You are aware of the fact that there are many writings, many documents and books on this planet that claim to be of divine origin. They can't all be true to that claim. On our program today, we'll see which one is.
Till the good news was written and the full truth revealed, that the church might be whole and Christ's fullness made real. Our Lord in His wisdom gave men gifts from above. The Spirit then taught them the truth in love.
Welcome to The Truth in Love. And now your host, Dave Miller.
Welcome to our program. We've been examining inspiration of the book we call the Bible. We found it claims to be inspired. And in our last program, we were looking at some of the vicious attacks which have been made on the integrity of the inspiration of the Bible. We want to look at some of these additional alleged errors and face the fact that throughout the centuries, people have leveled criticisms against the Bible, and yet those who have cared to study objectively and examine those claims, they have found those criticisms to be meritless, that in fact the Bible is fully consistent with itself, perfectly consistent, which is more than can be said about any other book ever written. Another one of those charges, critics have been especially critical of the Bible's portrayal of God in the Old Testament ordering the death of entire populations during the Israelite conquest of Canaan, including the extermination of women and children. The Hebrew term that is used in those contexts, cherem, found for instance in Joshua 5 verse 7, actually refers to the total dedication, the complete giving over of the enemy to God as a sacrifice, which involves indeed the extermination of the population. But you see, critics of the Bible allege that the God of the Bible is as barbaric and cruel as any of the pagan gods, but I believe that is an incorrect assessment. Because if the critic of the Bible would take the time to study the Bible, make an honest evaluation of the principles, for example, the principles of God's justice, God's wrath, God's love. You know, God is infinite in those attributes. If we understand that, we can see the perfect and harmonious relationship between those attributes. God's vengeance is not like the impulsive, irrational, emotional outbursts of pagan deities or even human beings. The God of the Bible is perfect in all of His attributes, and so He has perfect justice. He possesses perfect love, perfect anger. Just as God's ultimate and final condemnation of sinners to eternal punishment in hell will be just and appropriate. Likewise, the temporal judgment of wicked people in the Old Testament is perfectly ethical and fair. We human beings do not have an accurate grasp of the gravity of sin and the deplorable nature of evil and wickedness. In fact, human sentimentality is hardly a qualified measuring stick for divine truth and spiritual reality. I find it incredibly ironic that the atheist, the agnostic, the skeptic, the liberal thinker attempts to stand in judgment upon the ethical behavior of God when, if a person embraces their position, there's no such thing as absolute, objective, authoritative standards by which to pronounce anybody right or wrong. It was the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre who admitted, if there's no God, everything is permitted. So the atheist and the agnostic have absolutely no platform on which to stand, from which to make moral or ethical distinctions, except as the result of pure personal taste. The mere fact that they concede the existence of objective evil is an unwitting concession. There is a God who has established an absolute framework of moral judgments. The facts of the matter are, when you go back to the book of Joshua and read about the Canaanites whom God's people were to destroy, They were destroyed for their wickedness. Read closely Deuteronomy 9:4, Deuteronomy 18:9 through 12, and Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 through 28. You understand that Canaanite culture and religion in the second millennium BC were polluted, corrupt, and perverted. No doubt the people were physically diseased from their illicit behavior. There simply was no viable solution to their condition except destruction. Genesis 15:16 refers to their moral depravity becoming full. In other words, they had slumped to such an immoral, depraved state with no hope of recovery that their existence on this earth had to be ended. Just like in Noah's day, when God waited while Noah preached the gospel, preached salvation, preached freedom for years, but was unable to turn the world's population from its wickedness. Read Genesis 6:3 through 7. Well, why would God include the children in the destruction of such populations? Well, that's actually sparing those children from an even worse condition, that of being reared to be as wicked as their parents, and consequently they would face eternal punishment. Everyone who dies in childhood, according to the Bible, is ushered to paradise and will ultimately reside in heaven itself. Children who have parents who are evil will naturally suffer innocently while on earth. Read Numbers 14 and verse 33. Those people that disagree with God's annihilation of the wicked in the Old Testament have the same liberal attitude that has prevailed in this country for the last 30 to 40 years. That attitude has typically opposed, for example, capital punishment. It has opposed corporal punishment of children, spanking. But you see, that person simply cannot see the rightness of evildoers being punished by execution or physical pain. But I'm telling you, biblically, their view is warped, and the rest of us are being forced to live with the results of their warped thinking. Their undisciplined, out-of-control children are wreaking havoc on our society by perpetuating crime to historically all-time high levels. Do you also realize if you reject the ethics of God's destructive activity in the Old Testament, to be consistent, you must reject Jesus and the New Testament, because over and over again, Jesus and the New Testament writers endorse and defend that kind of activity. Read carefully Luke 13, 1 through 9, Luke 12, 5, Luke 17, 29 to 32, Luke chapter 10, verse 12. What about Hebrews 10, 26 to the end of that chapter? We need to go back and assess and investigate and analyze, and we'll see the truth of these matters. Another supposed error brought up by those who reject the inspiration of the Bible, they point out that Mark records in Mark 15:25 that the Lord was crucified at the third hour. But John in John 19:14 says that Jesus was tried before Pilate at the sixth hour, which would seem to be after the time Mark said Jesus was crucified. But you know what? The harmonization of this situation is so simple. If people really wanted to be unbiased and approach it and try to investigate and figure out what's going on, John based his reference on Roman civil time. Mark computed his reference according to Jewish time. We have to understand that the different writers of the Bible were addressing different cultures and different peoples, and therefore made different assessments of things like that in reckoning their time. You just need to find out which time factor he is using, and all of the alleged discrepancies with regard to chronology and time frame disappear. Some people have said that the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all give a slightly different wording of the inscription that was placed on the cross when Jesus was being crucified. Matthew 27:37 reads, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark 15:26 has it, "the King of the Jews." Luke's record, Luke 23:38, says, "This is the King of the Jews." And then John, in John 19:19, has Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So which is it? Well, notice that the four accounts do not contradict each other, They merely emphasize different elements. John obviously gives the most complete wording. So the reason for the variation is seen in the fact that the inscription at the cross was given in 3 different languages: Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Do you understand that an inscription in 3 different languages would hardly correspond word for word? And in addition to that, the 4 gospel writers were addressing racially different audiences. That accounts for the variation in the wording. What about Matthew 17, 12 through 13, and Mark 9, verse 13? There, John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, is said to be Elijah. But in John 1:21, John personally, while he was on the earth, denied being Elijah. So people have said there's a contradiction. But again, a little further study would easily explain what is going on here. Turn to Luke 1:17. There it is emphasized that John came to this planet, stepped out into his public work in the spirit and power of Elijah. In other words, John was not literally a physically reincarnated Elijah. He was figuratively the spiritual antitype of Elijah, and that's the point that Jesus made and clarified in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14. One type of criticism against the Bible involves situations where the same action is attributed to different people. For example, in Mark 10:35, James and John are said to have made the request to be the greatest in the kingdom. But in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, we find their mother making that request. A similar instance in Matthew 8:5, where a centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant. But you go to Luke 7:3, and the centurion sends that request through the elders of the Jews. Yet another example, 2 Samuel 12:9, where David is said to have killed Uriah. But in 2 Samuel 11:17, the Ammonites are said to have killed Uriah. All of these instances share in common the fact that it is very common to speak of a person doing something and being responsible for it, even though he does it through the agency of someone else. For example, in Matthew 20, verse 20, there we find indication that the mother of James and John was actually there on that occasion. She was accompanied by James and John, her 2 sons, when the request was made. So that is the explanation. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 29, and Mark 10, verse 46, we have another incident that's been challenged. We are told of the healing of blind men as Jesus was departing from Jericho. But when you turn to Luke's account, Luke 18:35, there Jesus is said to heal a blind man as he was coming near to Jericho. So 2 of the passages say as he was going away, he healed a blind man. This one says when he was approaching. I've seen several good explanations offered to adequately account for the difference in these 2 passages. The most intriguing one being that at the time of Christ, are you aware of the fact there were 2 Jerichos? One of the Jerichos in Palestine of Jesus' day, 1st century, was the Old Testament Jericho that you read about way back in Joshua 7, Joshua 6. Old Testament Jericho in Jesus' day lay mostly in ruins. Jericho was rebuilt nearby, and so there was a New Testament Jericho. In fact, it was built by Herod the Great. It was about 2 miles south of Old Testament Jericho. Now notice what could have happened. Jesus traveled from the north toward Jerusalem. He would have first passed through Old Testament Jericho. As he was leaving this Jericho, he would have performed the miracle of healing blind men given in Matthew and Mark. As he then approached the newer Jericho, traveling south, he would have been approaching Jericho and there performed the miracle reported by Luke. Do you understand that that explanation adequately accounts for the alleged discrepancy? Why don't we summarize some of the principles that are operative in sorting out and explaining these alleged contradictions in the Bible? For example, number one, passages can very easily be referring to different persons or objects, not the same person or object. You've got to determine that to begin with. Number two, passages may involve different time elements. That would explain the discrepancy. Number three, passages may employ words or phrases in different senses. You have to determine what the author is intending to do by his wording. Number four, passages may sometimes supplement each other, which is not contradiction. Understand that. That's not contradiction just because one writer supplements what another writer has to say. Which brings us to point number five. Contradiction occurs when two statements cannot both be true. And number six, a discrepancy is not sustained when a plausible possible explanation that allows for harmonization is available. And that's what we've done on our program today. Number seven, incompleteness of an account does not negate infallibility, because you see, a writer is perfectly free to select and or eliminate details to suit his purpose. So just because his account is incomplete compared to another writer's account doesn't make it wrong or contradictory. Number eight, the language of the Bible writers was adapted to the common language of the people of their day. And so, that language must not be expected to employ the language of scientific terminology. The way we want to say it, we must allow them to say it the way they would have said it in that culture and at that time. Number nine, figurative, poetic, and symbolic language are sometimes used in the Bible as the subject matter and as literary form may require. Think about that one. In number 10, Bible writers were perfectly free to paraphrase the Old Testament or other sources rather than giving verbally exact verbatim quotes. So, for example, the multiple languages that came into play, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, would also affect verbal correspondence. Principle number 11, parallel accounts in Scripture, especially Matthew, Mark, Luke, may legitimately differ from one another on the basis of authorial purpose, perspective, choice of details, mode of description. What was that author trying to do? Why did he word it differently than the other one? If you examine that in search, you'll find a legitimate, adequate explanation. I believe these principles, if we'll examine them carefully, will assist us in sorting out these alleged contradictions. The variety that exists in the Bible is actually one more proof that the Bible is inspired. That proves the writers of the Bible were not in collusion with each other. That proves that they present independent witness to the events that they were describing. So I'm telling you, every single alleged contradiction, and I'm telling you over the last 2,000 years since the completion of the New Testament, having been completed and placed in inspired form near the end of the first century, in the last 2,000 years, critics, skeptics, opponents of God's Word have tried every way they could to bring the Bible down, to discredit it, to show it to be the product of mere human beings. But I'm telling you, 2,000 years have gone by and they have failed to achieve their objective. That in and of itself is proof of the inspiration of the Bible. All right, we've examined the claims to inspiration that the Bible makes for itself. We've looked at some of the alleged errors and contradictions leveled against the Bible. And by the way, there are many books that have been written over the centuries answering many of the other alleged contradictions. We'd be happy to make those available to you or for you to know what they are if you'll simply write us. But now I'd like for us in the rest of this program to turn to the objective, independent evidence that exists to prove The Bible is what it claims to be. The infallible, plenary, inerrant, verbally inspired Word of God. I'm telling you, there may be a lot of documents on this planet that claim to be inspired, but can they prove that they are? The Bible does. Proof number one. We've really already presented this one. And that is that the Bible does not contradict itself. Do you understand that no genuine error or discrepancy has ever been sustained, even though critics, as we've said, have tried for centuries? The fact that the Bible is errorless proves its divine origin. It places it in a class by itself, because all written productions of mere humans have errors. I've examined a lot of books that claim to be from God, and I've been amazed at how easily it is to see contradictions that are inexplicable, that cannot be harmonized. The Bible never makes that mistake. Number two, a second proof for the Bible's integrity. Its stunning, uncanny accuracy in historical and geographical details. Human history books have always required correcting and updating. There's no history book written by humans that hasn't needed to be adjusted. Not so with the Bible. Critics, for example, once scoffed at the Bible's allusion to the Hittites, because at that point in history there was no known historical sources that made any reference to the people known as the Hittites, as the Bible referred to in Genesis 23:10, Genesis 26:34. There were skeptics that assailed the Bible. The Bible's not inspired, it refers to the Hittites. There were no such people. But suddenly, the archaeologist Spade uncovered at ancient Bogazkoy in modern Turkey an entire Hittite civilization. The Bible was right, while its critics were wrong. In the late 1800s, Sir William Ramsay, a respected scholar, in fact, he himself was skeptical of the authenticity of the Bible, especially the book of Acts. So he set out upon an archaeological expedition in Asia Minor with a specific purpose of disproving the historicity and accuracy of Luke's narrative in the book of Acts. You know, after years of research and exploration, Ramsay was forced to conclude Acts is historically accurate. Do you know the book of Acts? 28 chapters. There Luke refers to 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 Mediterranean islands. He refers to 95 different persons, 62 of whom are not mentioned, named anywhere else in the New Testament. That's putting your neck out on the line. Every single allusion, where checkable, has been shown to be absolutely historically accurate. Let me give you one quick example. In Luke wrote in Acts 13, verse 7, Sergius Paulus was a proconsul in Cyprus. Scholars were certain the Bible had to have been wrong because Cyprus was an imperial province. The proper title for its ruler would have been propraetor. But then it was discovered that by Paul's day, it had become a senatorial province. It had been moved under the jurisdiction from the Caesar to the Senate. So it was a senatorial province. Do you know what the proper title for the magistrate, the official ruler in a senatorial Roman province would have been in Paul's day? That title? Proconsul. Luke was uncannily, specifically, technically, very, very accurate. Another sample of the Bible's historical accuracy, Isaiah 20, verse 1. Sargon is mentioned there. He's said to be king of Assyria. You know, back over the last few centuries, theological critics, Eichhorn, Grotius, Michaelis, assailed the Bible, said it's inaccurate. There's no such Assyrian king. We have records of the Assyrian kings, and there was no Sargon. But in 1843, they found Sargon. We'll talk about him on our next program. I hope you're enjoying this study. I'll be back in just a moment. Please stay tuned.
I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you
hope to continue this study of the inspiration of the Bible on our next program, at which time I hope you will be with us to continue to examine these wonderful facts that further verify, affirm, and demonstrate the divine origin of the book we call the Bible. We are taking this entire series of programs and putting them on audio cassette tapes, and we are making them available to you free of charge, with no cost, no obligation. You won't be put on a mailing list and pestered for money or anything else. We simply want you to learn the truth. If you will write us at The Truth in Love, P.O. Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053, and request the free series on the inspiration of the Bible. Our volunteer workers will copy those tapes and get them packaged and mailed to you just as quickly as they can. Remember, our sole purpose here is to arrive at the truth, to learn what God would have us to know and to do. I hope to see you again.
Revelation has been given to man. Let us strive for the kingdom by God's clear plan. We must never be swayed by the doctrines of men. Speak the truth in love and grow up unto Him. Following God, following God, following God, following God, following God. Speaking the truth.